All right.
I think we're
live.
I think it's happening.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Hello, welcome everybody to our lunchtime live stream. The first episode, since last week was pilot episode 0, I think is how that works. Here at the lunchtime live stream, this sort of midweek engagement, for it to be a space to engage in dialogue with one another, both us here in person and virtually. To engage in dialogue with one another about the kingdom at work in and around the community of Newsong in order to pursue discipleship to Jesus and its application in daily life together. So welcome to this lunch space. Thank you for spending your lunchtime with us. We would love to hear sort of engagement through Facebook in comments or chat if that's a thing. And Becky is just off screen, ready to rock and roll. So if there are questions that folks have, or different participation elements, that there is somebody who's actively reading and watching and will interject. So if you hear a voice from elsewhere, it's just Becky on the couch behind the camera.
Or Dave on the TV.
Yeah.
That's right.
Dave, where are you?
So I am actually in Maryland with my siblings, trying to get my parents' house, who no longer live here, ready to put on the market for sale. My mom's in a memory care unit down in Houston, and the sale of the house will help continue to provide the funds for her to be able to be there. She's real close to my sister, is being well cared for, but this is one of those things that it kept getting put off little by little, and we're under deadlines. So I'll be back Friday, so I'll obviously be there Sunday, but I appreciate the technology that allows me to be present, because I hated to miss this one since our first one. So grateful. Thanks for inviting me to the Facebook Live. Glad to be here. It will be, as we just talked about a minute ago, sort of the challenge of the overlap, the delay of the technology. So I'll do my best to be sensitive to that. But yeah, glad to be here.
That's awesome.
Yeah, we're thankful for Zoom. Shameless plug for Zoom. I feel like they've kept us alive in many ways through all this. So to sort of, let's break the ice a little bit. This past week you talked about spiritual formation, and so I was wondering, what is one character quality of a person who has had impact on your spiritual formation? What's a character quality of that person?
Yeah, I think for me, when I think about people that have spiritually formed me and contributed to that part of my life, the word that comes to mind as like a characteristic to define them is grace. There has been I've heard it defined as margin. You give someone margin so that they can live into that space of becoming more authentic to who they are. I've also heard it described as believing the best even when you have every reason to assume the worst. And so when I think about people that have formed me, their posture towards me has been gracious in that way, that there's this desire to believe the best in me and what I'm capable of, even if they have every reason to believe the worst. And so I think that grace is probably one of those grounding things that I would think of when I'm thinking through the people that have characteristics of spiritually forming me. So that was the word that came to mind for me.
Gotcha. For me, the word that comes to mind, and probably because I talked about it last week, and it's sort of, we're always talking about it, is the word love, defined as I did last week, the engagement of the will for what is good. Because thinking about it in terms of mentors, there was a former pastor that I worked with in Tyler when we lived there, who happened to be a former missionary. So I grew up knowing him as a kid, and so I sort of had seen him across my life, ended up being able to work with him. And in terms of my life in ministry, was the pastor above all others, that as I look back and think about him and his life, had innately the capacity, the character trait of loving people. In other words, not just feeling good about them, but he truly, without knowing this language, was a person who was continually trying to be aware of his desire to want what's best for them, and to posture his life in such a way that whoever they were, that he wanted them to experience love to wanted the best for them in intangible, life-changing, not just sort of, oh, I like them, but he willed the good of people in a way, modeled that for me even before I understood the implications of that in ways far, far freer and far more clearly willed than any other pastor that I've worked under before.
That's awesome.
That is awesome. For me, I think the word that the character quality that I think about is kindness. That kindness is, it seems like such a subtle thing. Like it's like, I sort of think of like the story of Elijah, where God talks to Elijah and God's not in the fire or the earthquake but is in like a gentle whisper. That I think that kindness sort of has that sort of like power, because kindness so often doesn't take a lot to do, but still it's it's not as like taxing, I guess, or demanding in a way, but still there's this like subtle strength of kindness that like you have to be really present to be able to like be kind in the way that like this person that I'm thinking in particular, just like, in everyday sorts of ways that seems so monumental that it seems like one of those like, oh, this is holy ground. I had no idea, but this is also holy ground kind of thing. That's awesome. Yeah, in my experience, that sort of kindness brings that up. Helps me see it, I guess, is probably a better way of saying it.
Yeah.
Very cool.
So I have a question for you about your sermon. A general All right. You framed saying that like the way that emotions connect with our spiritual formation, in spiritual transformation, is often the most overlooked part of it. So would you just sort of briefly give some words to that?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think it's just expressing that we're, as human beings, we have these multiple dimensions to us, and we talk about them. The Bible talks about them as, love the Lord your God with all your mind, with all your heart, with all your strength, and so ultimately, it's the language that we use to sort of parse that out. Is ultimately, so we are creatures essentially at their core that are defined by our will. But then we also have thoughts which come with ideas and images and feelings, desires, sensations attached to them. And then we have our body that engages and acts essentially according to what begins with the will and gets translated into the stories that frame us, that we think, the way we see the world. So all of that works together. They're not separate compartments. Well, they are separate dimensions in some way, but all interwoven. Integrated, I would, as I've said before, I think the soul is a way of understanding how all those shape together. The soul's job is to integrate those so that they're moving together in the right direction, bringing about the experience of life that God desires for us, that we're intended to find, the peace, if you would, or the good life. So I think in my own experience, what that looks like then to be formed into the character of Jesus, to be, I said Sunday, not just spiritual formation in terms of something that's limited to spirit or feels religious and mystical, but more as a human being designed by God. What was God's desire that I should be, to be formed into that, which then we talk about as, the character of Jesus, or the kind of people through whom goodness naturally flows, the kind of people who naturally do what Jesus commanded us to do. The dimension that in my own experience, my experience with church and teaching and sermons, the most overlooked, the most missing part of, much of that was missing, the nuts and bolts of that, but the dimension that I think the church understands, so it overlooks the easiest, least talked about, is the role that our emotions play in that, which is more than just feelings. It is desires, sensations, the integration of those with my thoughts and the stories that drive me, all that's interrelated. and they play a significant role. So that's where I'm coming from, is I think it's a significant part of our spiritual formation. I can just say, in my own experience, I've never had been under a teaching that actually gave some clarity to that. While we acknowledge we have feelings and they're part of our life, I've never had anyone really connect those dots and say, so here's what you do with that. Here's how this works.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. And I think that leads to a follow-up question. So then, in your experience, both of you, everybody, why is it that way? Why are emotions the most overlooked thing in your experience?
I think for me, when I'm sitting with this question, I even can think about yesterday, and I had a moment where I was pretty grumpy and had a bad attitude, and if not checking in with myself of what's causing those emotions, I automatically go to blaming. I look for other things around me to blame as to why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling, and so it's your fault, and it's this thing and that thing. And so I think it's easy to operate in that space. I think that's a pretty common practice, but over the years I've learned for myself, I can blame you next time I feel that way. It's your fault.
I mean, you can, yeah. I just relate. Yeah. Yes. My toes are bruised, I think.
But I think the practice over the years that I have had to uphold for myself is to check what's causing those emotions and what's true about the thing that's running around in my head. Is it actually true that it's their fault that I feel the way I feel? Is it actually that situation that's making me angry? Or is there something inside of me that's causing me to have to rework and challenge those narratives? And I think that a lot of that time, oftentimes that gets fleshed out even in my own marriage of it's not necessarily Jake's fault that I feel the way I feel, but there's some kind of insecurity or uncertainty within myself that's causing me to react to what's happening around me. And so when I've done the self-check, the self-awareness of, okay, those things, there might be some validity to them, but they're not necessarily all true. When I stop blaming other things around me for the way that I'm feeling, it allows me to take a little bit more ownership and responsibility for the way that I feel and the way that I'm reacting. But I think that prior to being more aware of all that, I think that is something to easily overlook. I feel like it's something I have to regularly revisit within myself, for sure.
Yeah, I would agree. I would maybe think of it this way. Why the church hasn't done it, my thoughts would be, because obviously I don't have any way to prove it. My thoughts would be because we haven't understood. We understand that people have feelings, but we don't necessarily understand how to wrestle with that. And ultimately, faith is often more communicated from a rational perspective, that you believe certain things, you think certain things, thinking leading to believing, and that's the focus. It's often, introduced or exposed, sort of given exposure as, the goal is to believe the right things. And if that's, the big focus, and it generally is, then it naturally then leaves feelings out as if they're less important than that. And so I think the danger isn't so much why they're not doing it, because I think why we don't do it. I think we don't do it because we don't understand. I think that's the key, is we don't understand the implications of not exploring the role of our emotional life in the journey of our faith. That's the danger. And if we don't know there's a danger, then it's easy to focus on just the rational thought life of, we have to believe these certain things. And so, if we believe certain things, that makes us right or keeps us doing the right things. If I know this is the right thing to do, then I just am supposed to do it. And nothing's wrong with that. There are things that are right to believe and things that aren't right to believe. And there's benefit to making choices according to what is the right thing to do, for sure. Well, but if we don't understand the implications of the role of our thoughts, of the relationship between thoughts and our feelings, desires, sensations, that experience of our humanity, if we don't understand that those are related in such a way that there are consequences to not dealing with it, then it's easy to dismiss, because faith is largely approached from a thought head rational perspective anyway, and feelings just become, oh, well, the feelings follow, and those aren't relevant. And my argument in the series is they're critically relevant, and there's a major reason why we need to understand that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, both of you. And Becky, is there? Yeah.
We have a comment from Christy Hooley. She says, to have or show emotions can sometimes be seen as a weakness, or can be difficult to share since it forces us to be vulnerable. So a lot of times we stuff, blame, or ignore not only our emotions, but those of others as well. We as human beings also have a tendency to avoid acknowledging other people's emotions as well for some of those same reasons.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Christy.
Yeah. Thanks, Christy Hool. Love you, girl. And thanks for joining us in the conversation. And I agree. And I think, again, there is an interrelationship between our emotional side of life and what we think about then as our spiritual journey. I talk about those as, in spiritual maturity, emotional maturity, and, define those a certain way in the series. Because I think without that, if we don't understand the role of our emotions, then they have a major impact on our capacity to be spiritually mature. Spiritually mature being that we become the kind of people through whom goodness naturally flows, that we become the kind of people who naturally and easily do what Jesus commanded us to do. The role of our emotional awareness and life and health and wholeness is directly related to our capacity to grow in spiritual maturity. The statement I made last week is essentially our spiritual maturity is in direct proportion to our emotional maturity. Emotional maturity, again, not being like, you're childish. It's not that. It's emotional maturity. The definition I would say of that for the series is to be the kind of people who, like Jesus, to be one who, like Jesus, is living from a full awareness of the role of emotions in my life, primarily as I have a deep experience of being loved by God as I am. That in Brené's language, and again, I said this last week, it's not her truth, she just gave words to it, a way of understanding that to be well loved by God means that I'm worthy as one made in his image of love and belonging. And so am I living from that? If I get that, not just as a concept, not just as a rational thought, but I've learned to live from there, then I have a whole different place from which to, by the grace and through the grace of God, to offer that to others. From, as Chrissy's saying, like to be vulnerable, to acknowledge this is how I feel, and this is the ways in which it keeps me from feeling loved, or this is the way in which it's destructive in my life, and how do I engage that in such a way that I can posture my life to experience the love that God the engagement of God's will for good in my life, so that from that I can engage, love being the engagement of the will for what is good, I can love my neighbor. If you don't understand the way in which the one measures and limits or increases the other, then you'll hit a ceiling for your capacity to actually become the kind of person who can freely and naturally do what Jesus calls us to do, primarily thinking of it in terms of loving my neighbor as myself. If I don't love myself in the way that leads to my deepest sense of belonging and loved by God, then I don't have anything more to give from to love my neighbor. I will love them in limited ways, even if I don't know that I'm doing it.
Yeah. All this it sort of makes me think too, and I personally, and then I want to get, which you mentioned something, and I want to circle back to it, but that even like Christy was saying, but like I think that there's a large sense of like the social, we're almost, I should speak from my own experience, for myself, working with high school guys at Epic, that there's almost this even like socialization of like emotions aren't, or only certain emotions are okay. And then even thinking of like, the both of you know that I'm a big church history nerd, and that like even there's like this tendency through the millennia to want to reduce things like emotions to, like the flesh. And then they sort of, by doing that, can just write it off as if it's a bad thing, which is, an ancient Gnostic heresy. There's some church history nerdiness. But that the body is essentially, and all of its facets are good because Jesus is incarnational. That in Jesus, God took on all of what it means to be human, and so that all of it's wrapped up, that it's all at least made good, redeemed. But in my own life, even thinking like just recently, even of just different experiences of hurt and loss and sorrow, and like thinking even in my own narratives of there being negative emotions and how words shape worlds, and like how that feels unhelpful to me in this sort of season of life, to say some emotions are negative, as if they shouldn't be had, or they can be had but just a little bit. But things like, happiness or whatever, joy, there's no cap. But things like anger or like sorrow, there's a cap. You should only go so far for so long. And so I personally just think that this series is coming for me at a great time. And you there's this quote, and so I'm wondering how it just how it sort of sits with you, how it resonates. And you mentioned it earlier, but my capacity for spiritual maturity, one who effortlessly does what Jesus would do in my place, is directly proportional to my emotional maturity. One who, like Jesus, engages the world from a deep experience of being well loved. So how does that like sit with you? Just hearing that.
Yeah, I think for me, and even thinking about hearing that on Sunday, one of the words that really sticks out to me is effortlessly. I think, it can be interchangeable with naturally, but there was something gravitational about the word effortlessly. And when I think about things that come naturally, or in this frame of reference, effortlessly, I got to thinking about what that actually implies. And for me, effortlessly doesn't necessarily mean that it's automatic, but that there has been discipline and practice in my life that then just flows. So like one of the examples that I was thinking about to give me like a tangible thing to hold on to is that in 20 years of soccer, I at one point could effortlessly juggle like 200 times. Like it was just automatic, very easily, but it didn't just happen.
I'm impressed.
Right? Yeah. I don't know that I would be able to effortlessly do that now. Which is a good point, to recognize that this isn't just something that happens, but there's a discipline, there's a practice, there's something that when given consistency and attention, that it can become effortless. And so I really appreciated that, because it was discipleship and the naturally outflowing the goodness of God through me is not just going to automatically happen. There has to be discipline and practice. And so even referring back to what I was articulating earlier, with checking in with my emotions instead of shoving them down, which I think is what Christy was saying, like a little bit of this, you got to shove it down, don't pay attention to it. It's a negative emotion, push it away. Instead of doing that, it's becoming aware, identifying it, understanding that these feelings are real. So to sit with it, and then being able to name it allows us to process it, as opposed to not naming it, giving it more power over us, as opposed to, nope, this is something I can name. It's a practice, it's a habit that can be formed, that can then be embodied, which I feel like is the whole posture of this series. But being able to do that, I think, comes out of the heart of recognizing for myself that I am well loved. And I think that's why I love this series. I love how it's coming together, and we're only 1 week in.
Yeah.
So many things going on in my head that I don't have time to say. But yes, you're right on the money. It is where the series is headed. It is the understanding that, that as human beings, our feelings they are not positive or negative. a feeling isn't destructive, but the story I tell myself about that feeling, the place I let my thoughts go, I choose to let my thoughts go, can bring about a destructive response in my life to that feeling. I can be sad and yet at the same time have a feeling underneath that still somehow all is, if not well now, I have hope that that this somehow at some point this will pass, and because I know without words for exactly why or when it will be good again, which doesn't have to mean this was bad, I shouldn't, I'll always feel this way. I think there is an important role that feelings play. The most important thing to do is understand that they just are, like you're saying, Christy, like you're saying, and we need to own the feeling when it is there. Jesus is fully spiritually formed, meaning he is the only human being who ever became fully human in the way that we would talk about as if we look in the garden, chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. They're fully human. They're not without any of these emotions. They're aware of those and understand how to integrate those into the whole dimension of who they are in such a way, whether it's sadness or whether it's, excitement, feelings of joy or happiness, that it's still, all of it is in the context of all is good in that sense. And so that's where we're headed, is to try and understand the reality of our feelings, the way in which then they play a very critical role in shaping our perceptions, our stories, our thoughts. And if we don't understand how to be aware and talk about and experience and process what we're feeling in the here and now, knowing that you can only be where you are. So what do I do with it though when tragedy strikes and I'm deeply sad and part of me is angry, and faith oftentimes has told us, hey, just hang on, it's going to be okay. And we make light of and dismiss a reality that is important, but it doesn't have to be destructive. It will become destructive if I choose to believe that I just need to get past this. I just need to get past this, as opposed to knowing someday I won't be sad. I don't know how that will happen, because for now it might feel like I never will not be sad. So there's a role feelings play. God has given them to us. The clearer we understand what those are and the implications at deeper levels for our whole formation, in order to experience what I talked about, what I'm talking about this coming week, in order to experience the kind of life that is the life we all want, I have to be very aware. I have to become aware of the role of emotions, and at not just this identifying what they are, but what I do with it. What's their role in shaping me.
It makes me think, and I don't have thoughts really, but it just makes me think, and something that I feel like I'm gonna walk away and think about at least for the rest of the day, is a way like Romans 5, I think it's verses 3 and 4, where Paul talks about suffering produces perseverance, character, and character hope. The way that all of that, again, no thoughts, but something that I'll walk away wrestling with. I think there's a Facebook something, and then we'll move to close after that.
Sure. In reply to her original comment, Christy said, which can also be really difficult depending on upbringing, culture, etc. And Joanne Marty Eister said, society tells us that we are not to show our emotions, just to go through life like a robot.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a challenge. It's you don't, and that's so the original question is, why don't we do it? Because everything around us is telling us those make us too uncomfortable. So let's pretend they don't exist, and that complicates things. And that's why I say they have a critical role in our capacity to be who we want to be unaware of the implications of the reality and great potential goodness of my emotions, to shape me into being fully human, fully who God designed me to be, by God's grace. This isn't something I do on my own. By God's grace, automatically then it becomes a ceiling that keeps me from becoming who I really want to be, what I really want to be capable of, loving my neighbor as myself, of loving God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength. But if I don't understand clearly what does that look like when it comes to emotions that are painful, as well as it's easy to think about that when all is well and I feel good and I feel joyful and I feel happy. But what does that look like if I'm experiencing the feeling of the opposite? We've tended to say, let's ignore those. Culture's uncomfortable with that. We don't want to be vulnerable. But unless we are, there's the cap on our capacity to truly become fully human as Jesus was, truly by his grace, to understand how to stay and sit in the moment, aware of the reality of fear or sadness without it taking us out, without losing hope. It's important because so ultimately have to understand these are the 5 things that I want to unpack over the next couple of weeks is the essential role of faith, hope, love, joy, and peace as central to the steps to integrating and understanding so that we can be free to be the kind of people who, come what may, can love as Jesus loved, can feel the deep love of God in our own lives, and from that offer it to others.
Well, thanks for giving us a little teaser snippet into what's to come in the series. That's good.
Yeah, I'm very excited about it, and I hope it will be helpful. I hope that will give plenty of place to keep the wrestling and conversation going. I do believe deeply that this is a dimension of our spiritual life that unless we explore this, we'll never be capable of experiencing a kind of life that Jesus calls eternal life to the degree that he longs for us to. It doesn't make us bad people. It doesn't make us foolish. It just means that if we can't fix what we don't acknowledge. We can't give from what we don't have.
Yeah.
And I think this is the arena of our life that the church has missed, not necessarily by intention, though it easily gets that way. We choose not to talk about feelings. The culture doesn't want to. The church has, and to some degree, gone along with that. And I feel like I believe, I'll close with this, I think it's a major reason why the Christian faith, the transformative faith that is the way of Jesus, continues to lose traction for transforming the world in our day. Millions of people of faith are leaving the church, and I think a big part of that is because we've not understood the role of our emotional lives and all the ways that those are entrenched into what we believe and how we act and how we move in the world. We've missed that, and it's limited our capacity to be truly fully developing into the kind of people that Jesus desires and wants to lead us into.
That's so good. Well, thank you. Thanks for zooming in from Maryland. Thanks.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
I hated to be away. I didn't have a choice in this. And so, did I say where I am just so you know why I'm not there?
Yeah.
I'm at my parents' house. Did I mention that?
Yeah, you did.
With my siblings trying to get it ready for sale. So I'm thrilled to be here. I just regretted, even though I knew this needed to happen, that I wanted to be able to. So I'm thankful for technology. Thankful for you guys inviting me in.
Yeah. And these conversations will continue here, Facebook, same time and place, Tuesdays, and also in life groups. So to continue to work this out and see it in your own life, to sort of do that journey, life groups are all following along, and those questions are provided, and so those are going out. And if time and all that doesn't work, this is hopefully a space to be able to continue those conversations. So with that...
Yeah, let me say as well, Christy, Joanne, thank you guys too so much for joining us today and for sharing your thoughts with us. Again, this is the sort of vulnerability side of this. We're thankful for the conversation. Appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
All
right. Thanks, y'all. Have a good rest of your Tuesday.
Bye.
All right.
Bye.
See you guys in a few days.